Deep in the forgotten corners of a county auction house, Sarah stood alone in her bright yellow shirt, the only person willing to bid on the cursed Victorian mansion at 47 Ashford Street. For $300, she claimed what 5 families had abandoned in terror over the last decade, each fleeing in the dead of night without explanation. Her fiancé David thought she had lost her mind, but Sarah saw potential beneath the decay. On their first evening, clearing the dusty library, she pulled a leather-bound book from the shelf, and the entire bookcase swung inward with a groan, revealing a narrow stone staircase descending into absolute darkness. From somewhere deep below came a sound that made David's blood run cold, the slow, rhythmic creak of a rocking chair moving back and forth in the blackness. What had been sealed behind that bookshelf for so many years? Who was waiting in the hidden room below? And why had every family before them run for their lives? The air in the Clarkson County Municipal Building's auction room was thick with the scent of old paper, stale coffee, and the peculiar tension that came from people watching someone make a terrible mistake. Sarah Bennett stood out like a beacon of defiance in her bright yellow shirt, her posture straight and determined as she raised her hand for the 3rd time, her voice clear and unwavering as she called out, $300. The auctioneer, a portly man named Gerald, whose face had grown progressively more uncomfortable with each bid, adjusted his glasses and looked around the room one final time, his voice lacking any of the enthusiasm he had shown for the previous lots. I have $300 for the property at 47 Ashford Street, the Victorian mansion, sold as is. Where is? Do I hear $350? The silence that followed was profound and deeply unsettling, broken only by the scrape of chairs as people shifted to get a better look at the young woman who was sealing her fate. Beside her, David Morrison, her fiancé of 6 months, grabbed her arm, his handsome face creased with worry, his voice a desperate whisper. Sarah, please, we can find another project. This is insanity. You heard what they said about this place. She had indeed heard what they said, the whispers that had followed them since they walked into the room, the fragments of conversation that painted a picture of a house that consumed its owners. 5 families in 10 years, each one arriving with hope and leaving in terror, abandoning furniture, clothes, entire lives as they fled in the middle of the night. The last family, the Hendersons, had left just 6 weeks ago, their car packed so hastily that Mrs. Henderson's wedding album still sat on the mantel. Going once, Gerald called out, his voice tinged with something that sounded almost like regret. Going twice, he paused, giving Sarah one last chance to lower her hand, to walk away from what everyone in the room knew was a cursed property. But Sarah had done her research, had spent weeks in the county records office, and she knew something they did not. She knew that curses were often just convenient stories that hid far more tangible secrets. Sold, Gerald finally announced, bringing his gavel down with a crack that echoed through the silent room like a gunshot. To the young lady in the yellow shirt for $300. As Sarah walked to the front to sign the papers and hand over her cashier's check, the room erupted in a low murmur of pity and fear. An elderly woman in a floral dress reached out and touched her arm, her rimy eyes filled with genuine concern. Child, that house has a darkness in it, a weight that breaks people. Please reconsider. Sarah smiled gently at her, taking the deed from Gerald's trembling hands. Thank you for your concern, but I'm not afraid of old houses or old stories. What she did not say, what she kept locked behind her determined smile, was that she was very much afraid, but not of ghosts or curses. She was afraid of remaining powerless, of never taking a risk, of living a safe, small life. With the deed clutched in her hand and David's worried presence at her side, she walked out of that room knowing that her life had just changed forever, though she could not yet imagine how profoundly or how dangerously. The drive from the municipal building to 47 Ashford Street took only 12 minutes, but it felt like a journey into another world entirely. The neat suburban blocks giving way to older neighborhoods where ancient oaks formed a canopy over cracked sidewalks, and the houses grew progressively larger and more Gothic in their architecture. When they finally turned onto Ashford Street, Sarah's breath caught in her throat, not from fear but from a strange mixture of awe and heartbreak at what she saw. The Victorian mansion rose 3 stories into the gray autumn sky, its once grand facade now a study in neglect and decay, with peeling paint revealing layers of color beneath like archaeological strata documenting a century of different owners and different dreams. The wraparound porch sagged on one side, several of its ornate spindles missing like gaps in a broken smile, and the windows, tall and narrow in the Victorian style, stared down at them with a blind, dusty opacity that made the house look like it was sleeping or perhaps watching through half-closed eyes. David parked his truck in the weed-choked driveway, his jaw tight with disapproval, but Sarah was already out of the vehicle, her yellow shirt a bright spot of color against the house's melancholy grays and browns. The front door was unlocked, which should have been their first warning, and when Sarah pushed it open, the hinges screamed in protest, a sound like something in pain. The interior was even more disturbing than the exterior, not because it was empty, but because it was not empty enough. The entry hall's chandelier lay shattered on the hardwood floor, its crystals scattered like frozen tears, and beyond it, the house told a story of panicked flight. In the living room, furniture was overturned, a coffee table on its side with a mug still resting on the floor where it had rolled, the coffee long since dried to a dark stain on the Persian rug. Family photographs hung crooked on the walls, their subjects smiling out at the decay with oblivious happiness, and in the dining room, places were set for dinner, the plates still holding the desiccated remains of a meal that was never eaten. Sarah moved through the rooms with a growing sense of unease, David following close behind, his hand never far from his phone. It was in what must have been the master bedroom that they found the journal, a simple leather-bound book lying open on the nightstand beside a bed whose covers were thrown back as if someone had leaped from it in the middle of the night. Sarah picked up the journal carefully, her hands trembling slightly as she read the neat handwriting on the last page with writing, dated exactly 2 weeks before. October 3rd. The sounds are getting worse. Last night, David heard them too, so I know I'm not losing my mind. It comes from below, from somewhere in the walls or under the foundation, a rhythmic creaking like a rocking chair, but when we search, there's nothing there. The inspector came again today, 3rd time this month, always finding new violations, always with that same apologetic smile that doesn't reach his eyes. I think someone wants us gone. I think someone has always wanted us gone. But why? What could possibly be so important about this house that the entry ended there, mid-sentence, the pen trailing off into a jagged line as if the writer had been interrupted or had simply dropped the pen and run? Sarah looked up from the journal to find David staring at her, his face pale in the dim light filtering through the grimy windows, and in that moment, standing in the bedroom of strangers who had fled in terror, she felt the first real tendril of doubt wrap itself around her heart. They had decided to stay, at least for the night, despite the unsettling discoveries and the palpable atmosphere of fear that seemed to cling to every surface like the dust. David had wanted to leave immediately, to get back in the truck and never look back, but Sarah had convinced him with a logic that was perhaps more stubborn than sound. They needed to assess what they had bought, needed to understand the scope of the renovation, needed to prove to themselves that they were not the kind of people who ran from shadows and old stories. As the sun began its descent, painting the grimy windows in shades of orange and purple, they found themselves in what had once been a magnificent library, its walls lined floor to ceiling with built-in bookshelves made of dark mahogany, most of the shelves still holding books that previous owners had abandoned in their haste to escape. Sarah had always loved old books, loved the smell of aged paper and the weight of stories in her hands. So while David went to retrieve their overnight bags from the truck, she began to explore the collection, running her fingers along the spines, reading titles that spoke of another era. It was a leather-bound volume of Poe's complete works, wedged tightly between 2 larger books on the middle shelf, that caught her attention, its spine so snug against its neighbors that she had to grip it firmly and pull with both hands to extract it. The book came free with a soft grinding sound, and then the entire section of bookshelf, a panel perhaps 8 feet tall and 4 feet wide, shuddered and began to swing inward on hidden hinges that protested with a groan of metal that had not moved in years. Sarah stumbled backward, the book falling from her hands as the secret door revealed itself, and behind it, descending into absolute darkness, was a narrow stone staircase, its steps worn smooth by generations of feet, its walls close and oppressive. The air that flowed up from below was cold and damp, carrying with it the scent of old stone and something else, something organic and faintly sweet that made her stomach turn. For a long moment, she simply stared into that rectangular mouth of darkness, her heart hammering against her ribs, her rational mind trying to process what she was seeing, trying to reconcile the existence of a hidden passage with everything she thought she knew about the house. And then she heard it, drifting up from the depths below, the sound that had driven the previous owners mad with fear, the slow, rhythmic creak of a rocking chair moving back and forth, in perfect, measured beats. "Sarah?" David's voice came from the hallway, his footsteps approaching. "Sarah, I think we should." He appeared in the doorway and froze, his eyes going wide as he took in the scene. The open secret passage, Sarah standing before it, and that impossible sound rising from below. "No," he said immediately, his voice sharp with fear. "Absolutely not. We are not going down there. We are leaving right now." But Sarah was already moving toward the darkness, her curiosity and determination overriding every instinct that screamed at her to run. "Someone has been down there," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "Recently." The journal mentioned sounds from below, sounds the owners couldn't explain. "This is the answer, David. This is what they were hearing." She reached for the small flashlight on her keychain, its beam pathetically small against the yawning darkness. "I need to know what's down there." David grabbed her arm, his grip almost painful. "This is exactly how people die in horror movies. You realize that?" But even as he spoke, even as terror etched itself across his features, Sarah could see the same terrible curiosity beginning to kindle in his eyes, the need to know, to understand, to face the source of the fear rather than run from it. They descended together, David insisting on going first despite his fear, the beam of his phone's flashlight cutting through the darkness in a shaky cone of white light while Sarah followed close behind. One hand on his shoulder, her own smaller flashlight adding its feeble glow to his. The stone steps were treacherous, worn smooth by time and use, each one slightly different in height, forcing them to move slowly and carefully as the temperature dropped with each step downward, the air growing progressively colder and more stale until Sarah could see her breath pluming before her face. After what felt like an eternity but was probably only 20 steps, the staircase ended in a small stone landing, and beyond it, David's light revealed a rectangular room, perhaps 15 feet by 20, carved directly from the earth and lined with stone walls that glistened with moisture. The space was furnished like a strange underground parlor, filled with pieces that must have been moved down here decades ago. A Victorian settee with its burgundy velvet eaten away by time and insects. A small writing desk with one leg shorter than the others, a standing lamp with no bulb, and there in the corner, exactly as the sound had promised, a wooden rocking chair. It sat in perfect stillness now, but as they entered the room and their movement disturbed the stagnant air, it began to sway ever so slightly, its curved runners creaking against the stone floor in that same rhythmic pattern they had heard from above. Back and forth, as if an invisible occupant had just risen and walked away. David made a sound low in his throat, something between a whimper and a curse, but Sarah moved deeper into the room, her light sweeping across the furniture and then landing on the far wall where a heavy metal filing cabinet stood, its dark green paint scratched and dented, a substantial padlock securing its top drawer. Beside the cabinet were stacked cardboard boxes, perhaps a dozen of them, their sides bulging and soft with age and damp. Sarah knelt beside the nearest box, pulling back its flaps, which disintegrated under her fingers, and inside found layer upon layer of newspapers, their pages yellowed and brittle, their dates spanning from the early 1980 seconds to the mid-1990 seconds. She lifted the top paper carefully, angling her flashlight to read the headline, "Ashford Development Breaks Ground on Riverside Complex." The next paper announced another Ashford project, and the next, a chronicle of corporate expansion that seemed to dominate the local news for over a decade. David had moved to examine the filing cabinet, pulling experimentally at the padlock, which held firm. Why would someone hide old newspapers in a secret basement room? He asked, his voice echoing strangely in the confined space. And why lock a filing cabinet down here where no one would ever find it? Sarah was wondering the same thing as she opened another box and found more newspapers, these ones marked with highlighter and handwritten notes in the margins, annotations that said things like "City Council vote," "Check Morrow's campaign donors," and "3 families displaced. Where did they go?" Someone had been conducting an investigation, meticulously documenting something related to Ashford Development Corporation, and they had hidden their research in a room that was itself hidden. A secret within a secret. She stood, brushing the dust from her jeans, and looked around the room with new eyes, seeing not a place of supernatural terror but a place of very human purpose, A place where someone had worked to uncover a truth they believed was worth hiding. "David," she said slowly, her mind racing through implications and possibilities, "I don't think this house is haunted. I think someone wanted people to believe it was haunted, wanted them too frightened to stay, too terrified to look too closely. I think this room and whatever is in that filing cabinet is the reason 5 families ran away in fear." They spent the next 2 hours in that cold stone room, Sarah methodically going through every box while David used his phone to photograph everything. The weak signal from above barely reaching this depth, but enough to timestamp their discoveries. What emerged from the yellowed newspapers and handwritten notes was not a ghost story but something far more chilling, a pattern of systematic harassment and intimidation that stretched back 3 decades. Sarah found a manila folder in the 3rd box, its label written in precise block letters, "Previous owners, documentation." Inside were photocopied documents, meticulously organized, showing the tragic trajectory of family after family who had owned 47 Ashford Street. The first was the Morrison family, no relation to David despite the shared surname, who had purchased the house in 1994 and lasted only 8 months before fleeing. Their file contained copies of escalating code violations, starting with minor issues like a loose porch railing and progressing to citations for foundation cracks that appeared overnight. Electrical problems that 3 separate inspectors somehow found in a system that had just passed inspection weeks before, and a final condemnation notice for structural instability that was mysteriously withdrawn after they sold the property. Attached to their file was a letter from Ashford Development Corporation offering to purchase the house for $60,000, a fraction of what the Morrisons had paid, and a handwritten note that simply said, "Accepted, they had no choice." The pattern repeated with horrifying consistency through the Patterson family in 1998, the Chengs in 2003, the Williamses in 2008, and most recently the Hendersons, whose file was the thickest of all. Each family's story was the same. They would move in with hope and excitement, then within weeks the violations would begin, always from the same county inspector, a man named Gerald Pritchard, the same Gerald who had conducted today's auction with such evident discomfort. The violations would escalate, mysterious problems would appear, foundations would suddenly crack, pipes would burst, electrical fires would start in walls that had been perfectly safe days before. And always, like clockwork, Ashford Development Corporation would appear with an offer, always insultingly low, always accompanied by veiled threats about the cost of repairs and the danger of living in such a problematic structure. But what made Sarah's blood run cold was the additional layer of terror that had been deployed against the families who resisted the financial pressure. The hauntings. Each file contained witness statements, diary entries, or in one case a frantic letter to a paranormal investigation society, describing the same phenomena: footsteps in empty rooms, doors slamming, objects moving, and always the sound of that rocking chair creaking in the depths of the house. A sound that seemed to come from nowhere and everywhere at once. The Hendersons' file included the journal they had found upstairs, photocopied here along with other pages that hadn't been left behind. Pages that documented their growing terror and their final decision to abandon everything, to lose their life savings and run rather than spend one more night in the house. At the bottom of the folder was a single sheet of paper, a photocopy of a property deed from 1892, and written across it in angry red ink were the words, "They want this land, but they'll never get it legally. The deed protects it. Margaret knew. Margaret fought them. This is her house, her evidence, her legacy. They killed her for it, and they'll kill anyone who discovers the truth." Sarah looked up from the documents, her hands trembling, and met David's eyes across the dim stone room, both of them understanding in that moment that they had not bought a haunted house but something far more dangerous. They had bought the scene of a crime and evidence of a conspiracy that powerful people would do anything to keep buried. They had emerged from the hidden room just after midnight, their minds reeling from the discoveries, their phones full of photographs that documented a conspiracy spanning decades. And Sarah had insisted they lock the secret door and say nothing, tell no one until they had decided what to do with the information they had uncovered. They spent what remained of the night on the dusty settee in the parlor, neither of them able to sleep, jumping at every creak of the old house settling, seeing shadows where there were none, their newfound knowledge transforming every sound into a potential threat. Morning came gray and cold, and they were in the kitchen trying to coax life from the ancient coffee maker when the sharp rap of knuckles against the front door made them both freeze. Through the window, Sarah could see a white county vehicle parked in the driveway, its official seal gleaming dully in the overcast light. And the man standing on the porch was the same Gerald Pritchard whose name had appeared on every violation in the hidden files, a man in his 60s, with a soft, doughy face and eyes that never quite met yours directly. "County building inspection," he called through the door, his voice carrying the false cheerfulness of a man performing an unpleasant duty. "Need to have a look around. Had some complaints called in about the structural integrity." Sarah opened the door, forcing her face into a neutral expression even as her heart hammered against her ribs. And Gerald stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, pulling out a clipboard and a flashlight, his movements practiced and efficient. He spent the next hour moving through the house, and Sarah watched with growing anger as he performed his theatrical inspection, tapping walls with knowing frowns, shining his light into corners and shaking his head with exaggerated concern, making notes on his clipboard with the satisfied air of a man finding exactly what he expected to find. When he finally returned to where Sarah and David waited in the entry hall, his expression was grave, almost apologetic, but Sarah could see the calculation in his eyes, the cold assessment of how much pressure would be required to break them. "I'm afraid I've got some bad news," Gerald said, tearing a yellow citation form from his clipboard. "Your foundation has significant structural compromise, cracks in the load-bearing walls, potential subsidence in the basement. This is a Class A violation requiring immediate remediation. I'm giving you 30 days to complete repairs, estimated cost around $50,000, and until the work is certified complete. The house is technically uninhabitable." He handed Sarah the citation, and she stared at it, seeing the same language, the same codes, the same manufactured emergency that had been used to terrorize 5 families before them. "This house was inspected 2 months ago," Sarah said quietly, her voice steady despite her fury. "The previous owners had it evaluated when they were trying to sell. The inspection report showed minor cosmetic issues but nothing structural. How is it possible that in 6 weeks, the foundation suddenly developed catastrophic problems?" Gerald's smile tightened, a flash of irritation crossing his features before he smoothed it away. "Houses deteriorate, Miss Bennett, especially old ones that haven't been properly maintained. You bought the property as is, you assumed the risk. I'm just doing my job, keeping people safe." He tipped his cap and left, and Sarah stood holding the citation, a piece of paper that demanded money they did not have to fix problems that did not exist. That night, as darkness fell over 47 Ashford Street, the house came alive with sounds that were designed to terrify. Footsteps echoed from the empty rooms upstairs, a heavy, deliberate tread that moved from one end of the hall to the other. Doors slammed with explosive force, the sound reverberating through the old walls, and from somewhere deep below, that rhythmic creaking started again, the ghost of a rocking chair moving back and forth in the hidden stone room. David stood in the center of the parlor, his face pale and drawn, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "That's it," he said, his voice shaking. "I don't care what's in those files. I don't care about conspiracies or patterns. We are leaving right now, tonight, before something worse happens." But Sarah was standing at the window, staring out at the dark street, and she had seen something he had not. A panel van parked 3 houses down, its windows tinted, its engine running, someone inside watching and waiting. "It's not ghosts, David," she said softly. "It's them. They're in the house, in the walls. They have speakers or devices. They're creating these sounds to drive us out just like they did to everyone else. They're watching us right now, waiting for us to break, waiting for us to run." Sarah waited until the sound stopped, until the house fell back into its watchful silence, and then, in the gray light of dawn, she slipped out the back door while David kept watch from the upstairs window, looking for any sign of the surveillance van. The neighboring houses on Ashford Street were a mixture of occupied and abandoned, victims of the same slow decay that had claimed so much of the old district. But 3 houses down on the left, Sarah saw signs of life. A well-maintained garden, fresh paint on the shutters, and a porch swing that looked recently used. She knocked on the door, and after a long moment, it opened to reveal a woman in her 80s, small and bird-like with sharp, intelligent eyes that took in Sarah's rumpled clothes and exhausted face with a single assessing glance. "You're the girl who bought the Ashford house," the woman said, and it was not a question but a statement of fact delivered with a mixture of pity and something that might have been respect. "I'm Eleanor Marks." I've lived on this street for 63 years, and I watched 5 families run from that place like the devil himself was chasing them. So the question is, are you here to tell me you're the 6th, or are you here to ask me why? Sarah felt something loosen in her chest, a knot of tension unwinding at the discovery of someone who might actually have answers. I'm here to ask why, she said. Eleanor stepped back, opening the door wider. Then you'd better come in and have some coffee. Because it's a long story and not a particularly pleasant one. They sat in Eleanor's cozy kitchen, surrounded by photographs that chronicled decades of life on Ashford Street. And Eleanor poured coffee from a percolator that probably dated to the Eisenhower administration, her hands steady despite her age. The house was built in 1892 by Margaret Ashford. Eleanor began, her voice taking on the cadence of a story told many times, though perhaps never believed. She was a remarkable woman. A widow who made her fortune in textiles and used it to build one of the finest homes in the city. She was my grandmother's dearest friend, and I knew her when I was a girl. Before she disappeared. Sarah leaned forward, her coffee forgotten. Disappeared? Eleanor nodded, her eyes distant with memory. Margaret had a son, Thomas, who died in the First World War, and a grandson, Richard, who inherited her business when he came of age in the 1952. Richard was ambitious, brilliant with money but completely without sentiment or conscience, and he saw the old district not as history but as opportunity. He began buying up the historic properties quietly, using shell companies and dummy corporations, planning to demolish them and build commercial developments. Shopping centers and office parks where century-old homes had stood. Margaret found out in 1960, discovered documents in his office that laid out his plans, and she was horrified. These weren't just any buildings. They were landmarks, pieces of the city's soul, and one of them was her own home. She threatened to expose him, to go to the Historical Society and the newspapers, to use her considerable influence to stop him. The old woman's voice dropped lower, and she wrapped her hands around her coffee cup, as if seeking warmth against a chill that came from memory rather than temperature. Richard came to see her one evening in September of 1960. I remember because I saw his car parked in her driveway, and they argued. You could hear their voices from the street. The next morning, Margaret was gone, simply vanished without a trace. Richard told everyone she had decided to travel to Europe, said she left him a note, but I never believed it. Margaret would never have left without saying goodbye, would never have abandoned her cause, and most damning of all, she would never have left her house. She loved that place more than anything, said it was her legacy, her proof that a woman could build something that would outlast the men who tried to tear everything down. Eleanor looked up at Sarah, her aged eyes suddenly fierce. They never found a body, never found any evidence of foul play, and Richard inherited everything, the house, the business, the fortune. And ever since that day, that house has been a battleground. Families move in thinking they've found a treasure, and then the pressure begins, the violations, the fear, until they break and run, and the house stays empty, stays in legal limbo, because Richard's company, now run by his son and grandson, can never quite acquire it legally because of clauses Margaret put in the original deed, so they make sure no one else can have it either. Armed with Eleanor's story and a borrowed toolkit that included a sturdy pair of bolt cutters, Sarah and David returned to the hidden room that afternoon, the secret door swinging open with less protest this time, as if the house itself was ready to yield its secrets. The stone chamber felt different now, less like a tomb and more like an archive, a repository of truth that had been waiting decades for someone brave enough or stubborn enough to listen. David knelt before the metal filing cabinet, examining the heavy padlock with the focused intensity of a man who had once spent a summer working for a locksmith uncle. And after several minutes of careful work with 2 bent paper clips, the lock gave a satisfying click and fell open in his hands. Sarah held her breath as he pulled open the top drawer, revealing not the random clutter of forgotten storage but a meticulously organized collection of folders, each one labeled in the same precise handwriting they had seen on the newspaper annotations. Property acquisitions 1,955 to 1,960. Forged documents, city council corruption, financial records, and at the very back, a folder simply labeled The Map. David carefully lifted out the folders one by one, laying them on the dusty floor where their flashlights could illuminate the contents. And what they found was nothing less than a complete dossier of corporate crime spanning decades. Margaret Ashford had been methodical in her investigation of her own grandson, documenting every illegal land acquisition with copies of the original deeds and the forged transfer documents that Richard had used to claim ownership, each forgery marked with her notes pointing out the discrepancies in dates, signatures that didn't match known handwriting samples, notary stamps from officials who had been dead for years. There were bank statements showing payments to city officials, photocopies of checks made out to councilmen and planning commissioners, each one carefully cross-referenced with dates when those same officials had voted to approve Richard's development projects or had expedited demolition permits for historic properties. Sarah's hands trembled as she opened the folder labeled The Map, and inside found a large-scale survey of the entire historic district, hand-drawn on architect's paper, with dozens of properties marked in red ink, each one annotated with dates and notes. Some were marked demolished 1956, others acquired 1958, and still others, perhaps a dozen of them, were marked target, active resistance, including 47 Ashford Street and several other properties on the same block. Margaret had identified the pattern, had seen that her grandson was systematically destroying the historic heart of the city, replacing irreplaceable Victorian and colonial homes with strip malls and parking lots, erasing history for profit. But the most damning evidence was in a thin folder at the bottom of the drawer, a collection of letters between Richard Ashford and various business associates, and in these letters, written in Richard's own hand, he discussed strategies for discouraging property owners who refused to sell. Methods that included everything from strategic code violations to what he euphemistically called atmospheric pressure, which Sarah realized with a chill meant the manufactured hauntings, the psychological warfare that had been used against 5 families and was now being deployed against her. At the very bottom of this folder was a letter dated September 15th, 1960, just days before Margaret disappeared, and it was addressed to the editor of the city newspaper, a formal letter of accusation in which Margaret laid out her grandson's crimes and announced her intention to turn over all evidence to the authorities. The letter was signed and sealed, ready to be mailed, but it had never been sent, because Margaret Ashford had vanished before she could drop it in a mailbox. And now Sarah understood with terrible certainty that Eleanor's suspicions had been correct. Margaret had not disappeared, she had been disappeared, silenced by the very family she had tried to stop. That evening, while David stood guard at the windows watching for the surveillance van, Sarah sat cross-legged on the dusty library floor with her laptop, the glow of the screen illuminating her face as she dove deep into the digital footprint of Ashford Development Corporation and its current leadership. What she found was both terrifying and clarifying, a picture of power and corruption that had grown exponentially from its toxic roots in the 1950 seconds. The company was now run by Richard Ashford III, grandson of the original Richard who had likely murdered Margaret, and his photograph on the company website showed a man in his early 50s, handsome in the way that money makes men handsome, with silver-streaked hair, an expensive suit, and eyes that held the same cold calculation Sarah imagined his grandfather must have possessed. Under his leadership, Ashford Development had become a behemoth, one of the largest property development firms in the tri-state area, with a portfolio that included shopping centers, office complexes, luxury condominiums, and according to their promotional materials, a commitment to urban renewal and historic preservation, words that must have been bitter ashes in the mouths of anyone who knew the truth. Sarah traced the company's board of directors and found connections that made her stomach turn. 3 city councilmen listed as consultants, the county planning commissioner serving as an advisory board member, and Judge Patricia Vance, who had presided over numerous property disputes, holding shares in a subsidiary company. The web of corruption had not diminished with the passing generations but had grown more sophisticated, more entrenched, more protected by the veneer of legitimacy that money and time could purchase. But it was in the historical archives of the city newspaper, accessible through the library's digital database, that Sarah found the pattern made explicit, the blueprint for the manufactured curse that had driven 5 families from 47 Ashford Street. A small article from 1995, buried in the local business section, profiled a security consulting firm called Sentinel Solutions that specialized in property protection and tenant management, and its founder, a former military intelligence officer named Marcus Webb, was quoted saying their methods included psychological deterrence, and environmental manipulation to encourage unwanted occupants to voluntarily vacate properties. The article noted that Sentinel Solutions' biggest client was Ashford Development Corporation, and while it framed their work as legitimate security services, Sarah recognized it for what it was, a corporate front for harassment and intimidation. She found patents filed by a subsidiary company for remote acoustic devices and sensor-triggered environmental systems, technology that could create sounds, move objects, manipulate temperature and lighting, all controlled wirelessly from a distance, all designed to simulate paranormal activity with such precision that even rational people would begin to doubt their own senses. The curse was not supernatural, it was technological, a carefully orchestrated campaign of psychological warfare that exploited humanity's primal fear of the unknown, and it had been deployed against every family who had refused to surrender the house quickly enough. Sarah looked up from her laptop, her eyes meeting David's across the dim room, and she felt a strange mixture of relief and rage. Relief that they were not losing their minds, that the footsteps and slamming doors and creaking rocking chair were not evidence of the supernatural but of very human evil, and rage that generations of the Ashford family had terrorized innocent people, had destroyed lives and history, had possibly committed murder, all in service of profit and the simple, cruel exercise of power over those who dared to resist them. The escalation came the very next morning, as if Sarah's research had triggered some alarm in the Ashford surveillance system, alerting them that their target was getting too close to understanding the truth. This inspector was different from Gerald Pritchard, younger and harder, with the cold efficiency of a man who viewed intimidation as simply another tool in his professional toolkit, and he arrived with 2 assistants carrying equipment that looked far too sophisticated for a routine building inspection. His name tag identified him as James Morrison, county structural engineer, and he moved through the house with the confidence of a man who had already written his report before arriving, his assistants taking photographs and measurements that Sarah suspected would be doctored to support whatever conclusion had already been purchased. When he emerged from the basement after barely 10 minutes, his face was grave with manufactured concern. "This structure is imminently dangerous," he announced, pulling out an official form printed on county letterhead. "Critical foundation failure, compromised load-bearing walls. The entire building could collapse at any moment. I'm issuing an immediate evacuation order. You have 4 hours to remove your personal belongings, after which the property will be posted as condemned and entry will be illegal." Sarah, who had spent the previous night learning the exact codes and regulations governing structural condemnation, stepped forward with a calm she did not feel. "I want to see the engineering report, the stress analysis, the foundation survey. Under County Code Section 47.3, any condemnation order must be accompanied by detailed documentation and photographic evidence showing the specific structural failures, and the property owner has the right to request an independent third-party evaluation before any evacuation order takes effect." Morrison's face tightened, a flash of anger breaking through his professional mask. "The documentation will be filed with the county by end of business today, but the evacuation order is effective immediately for public safety reasons. If you refuse to comply, I'm authorized to contact law enforcement to enforce the order, and I should warn you that continued occupancy of a condemned structure is a criminal offense." He leaned closer, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper that his assistants could not hear. "You seem like a smart young woman, so let me be clear. You cannot win this fight. There are forces at work here that you cannot possibly understand, and the smart thing, the only thing, is to cut your losses and walk away while you still can." He left, and Sarah stood holding the evacuation order, a piece of paper that gave them until 6 o'clock that evening to abandon everything they had discovered. That night, as if to punctuate the threat, someone cut the power line to the house, plunging them into darkness, and when David tried the faucets, nothing came out but a dry, rattling groan from pipes that had been shut off at the street. They lit candles and flashlights, creating islands of light in the oppressive darkness, and that was when the real assault began. The technology deployed with an intensity that suggested desperation on the part of their tormentors. Objects began to move with no visible cause. Books flying from shelves, dishes sliding off tables and shattering on the floor, picture frames swinging wildly on their hooks before crashing down. Footsteps pounded through the upstairs hallway, so loud and heavy that the ceiling shook, and doors slammed with such force that the ancient hinges began to tear from the wood. And from the hidden room below, audible even through the closed bookshelf door, came the sound of that rocking chair moving with manic intensity, creaking faster and faster, accompanied now by what sounded like whispered voices, a susurrus of unintelligible words that seemed designed to suggest madness and malevolence. David stood in the center of the parlor, his flashlight beam shaking as it swept across the chaos, his face pale and slick with sweat. "This is insane, Sarah. We can't stay here. They're going to hurt us. They're going to—" But Sarah was already moving toward the library, toward the hidden door, because she had realized something crucial. If they were intensifying the hauntings to this degree, if they were throwing everything at Sarah and David in one overwhelming assault, it meant they were afraid. It meant they knew that time was running out. And it meant that whatever Margaret Ashford had hidden in that room was dangerous enough to warrant this level of desperate intimidation. The assault of manufactured supernatural phenomena continued for another hour, reaching a crescendo of crashing objects and pounding footsteps that would have sent any reasonable person fleeing into the night. But Sarah and David were no longer reasonable, they were angry, and anger had burned away the last vestiges of fear. David, who had spent 2 years in college studying electrical engineering before switching to business, began to notice patterns in the chaos, inconsistencies that his analytical mind could not ignore. The footsteps always moved in the same path, never deviating, never responding to their presence. The doors slammed in sequence, as if triggered by a timer rather than by any conscious malevolence. And most tellingly, the whispered voices from below had a strange metallic quality, a faint distortion that reminded him of cheap speakers pushed beyond their capacity. Armed with this suspicion and a screwdriver from the toolkit Eleanor had lent them, David began a systematic examination of the house, starting with the upstairs hallway where the phantom footsteps had been loudest. It took him 20 minutes of careful inspection, running his hands along the baseboards and crown molding, before he found it, a small rectangular device no bigger than a deck of cards, painted the same color as the wall trim, tucked into the corner where 2 hallways met. It was a motion sensor connected to what appeared to be a pressure-activated mechanism in the floorboards, designed to create the sound of footsteps when anyone passed beneath it. Once he knew what to look for, he found them everywhere. Speakers hidden in air vents, motion sensors disguised as electrical outlets, even a small mechanical arm in the library that could push books off shelves when triggered remotely. It was an elaborate system, probably installed over decades and updated as technology improved, a network of devices that could simulate every form of paranormal activity from mysterious sounds to moving objects, all controlled wirelessly from somewhere outside the house. Sarah joined him in the investigation, and together they documented each device with David's phone camera, building evidence of the technological fraud that had terrified 5 families into abandoning their home. But it was when they descended into the hidden room, flashlights cutting through the darkness, that they made the discovery that transformed their understanding from academic to immediate danger. The stone floor of the chamber was covered in a thick layer of dust, undisturbed except for the tracks they had made during their previous visits, or so Sarah had thought. But now, looking more carefully, David pointed his light at a second set of footprints, fresh prints that cut across their own path and led directly to the filing cabinet they had opened the day before. Someone else had been down here, recently, perhaps even while they were upstairs dealing with the manufactured hauntings. The boot prints were large, military-style treads, and they told a story that made Sarah's skin crawl. Someone had entered through the stone staircase, had examined the filing cabinet and seen that the lock had been picked, had looked through the folders to assess what had been discovered, and had then retreated back up the stairs. David followed the prints to the staircase, and then made a discovery that stopped him cold. Set into the stone wall at the base of the stairs, cleverly disguised as just another stone, was a small panel that swung outward when pressed, revealing a modern electronic keypad. The hidden room had a second entrance, one that opened from outside the house, and someone with the access code had been using it to monitor their investigation, to track what they knew. And Sarah realized with sick certainty that every moment they had spent in this room, every document they had read, every photograph they had taken, had been observed by the very people they were trying to expose. With the knowledge that they were being watched, that every move they made in the hidden room was potentially monitored by whoever had access to the secret entrance, Sarah and David worked with a new urgency, understanding that their window of opportunity was closing rapidly. Sarah returned to the filing cabinet, pulling out every folder, every scrap of paper, determined to find whatever Margaret Ashford had thought important enough to hide and protect for decades. It was in the very bottom drawer, underneath a false bottom that David discovered by accident when the drawer seemed shallower than the others, that Sarah found Margaret's personal journal. A small leather-bound book with pages yellowed by age and filled with elegant handwriting that grew progressively more urgent and less controlled as the entries progressed toward their final conclusion. The early entries from 1960 detailed Margaret's growing horror at discovering her grandson's schemes, her determination to stop him, her careful documentation of his crimes. But it was the final entries, written in September of that year, that made Sarah's hands tremble as she read by flashlight in that cold stone room. September 10th. Richard came to the house today with two men I did not recognize. They were not businessmen, but something else, something dangerous, and he told me that I needed to destroy my evidence and forget what I had learned. He said that family loyalty demanded silence. I told him that morality demanded truth, and he left without another word, but the look in his eyes was one I had never seen before. My own grandson looked at me as if I were an obstacle to be removed, rather than a person to be loved. The entries continued, each one more desperate than the last, as Margaret described being followed, finding her phone line dead, discovering that her attorney had suddenly refused to take her calls. And then the final entry, dated September 18th, 1960, written in handwriting that shook with either fear or fury. They've threatened me, but I won't be silenced. I've taken precautions. I've hidden the original deed to this house, and the final proof of the forgeries where Richard will never find it. In the one place he fears, the place where his father died, where guilt and memory keep him away. If anything happens to me, if I disappear, someone will eventually find what I've hidden, someone brave enough to look where others will not. This house is my legacy and my testimony, and it will outlast the men who tried to destroy it. The entry ended there, and Sarah sat in silence, her mind racing through the implications. Margaret had hidden something more, some final piece of evidence that was even more damning than what they had already found, and she had hidden it in a place that Richard Ashford feared, a place connected to his father's death. But more chilling than the mystery of the hidden evidence was the terrible certainty that settled over Sarah as she reread that final entry. Margaret Ashford had never gone to Europe, had never traveled anywhere, had never left this house alive. Eleanor's suspicions had been correct, and the truth that Sarah now understood with bone-deep certainty was that Margaret was still here, had been here all along, hidden somewhere in this structure by the grandson who had murdered her to protect his empire of fraud and destruction, and for 65 years, her body had rested in some secret place while her evidence waited in the darkness for someone to finally bring her truth into the light. They spent the rest of that night going through Margaret's papers with a new urgency, knowing that whoever had the keypad code could return at any moment, and it was in a journal entry dated September 10th, 1960, that Sarah found the clue she had been searching for. Margaret had written in her precise, elegant script, "Richard came again today, more threatening than before, but I will not be intimidated. I have hidden the original deed and the most damning evidence where he will never find it, in the one place he fears, the place where his father died, the place he refuses to enter even now after all these years." Sarah read the passage 3 times, her mind racing through the implications. And then she remembered something Eleanor had mentioned about Thomas Ashford, Margaret's son, dying in World War I. She grabbed her laptop and searched for Thomas Ashford's obituary, and there it was in the 1918 newspaper archives, killed in action in France, buried in the basement of the family home per his mother's wishes until he could be properly interred after the war. The basement. There was another room in the basement, a place Richard Ashford would never enter because it held his father's temporary grave. Sarah and David descended the main basement stairs, their flashlights revealing a large open space filled with the standard detritus of a century, old furniture, steamer trunks, and a massive coal furnace that dominated one wall. But Sarah was looking for something else, and she found it behind a stack of rotting boxes, a section of the stone wall that sounded hollow when tapped, and unlike the surrounding stones, these were held together not with ancient mortar but with something that could be pried apart. It took them an hour of careful work with crowbars and hammers, the physical labor a welcome release from the mental strain of the past days, before the false wall finally gave way, revealing a small chamber beyond. Perhaps 8 feet square, its walls lined with brick rather than stone. David's flashlight beam cut into the darkness, and what it illuminated would haunt Sarah for the rest of her life. Seated at a small wooden desk, her back to them, was a skeleton dressed in the rotted remains of a dark blue dress, one skeletal hand still clutching a fountain pen, the other resting on a stack of papers as if she had been writing when death came. This was Margaret Ashford, who had not disappeared in 1960 but had been sealed alive in this hidden chamber, probably by her own grandson, left to die in the darkness with her evidence around her. Sarah felt tears streaming down her face as she approached the desk, this woman who had fought so hard for truth and had paid the ultimate price for her courage. On the desk before Margaret's remains was a complete and devastating archive, the original 1892 property deed, its language explicitly stating that 47 Ashford Street was to be preserved in perpetuity as a historic landmark and could never be demolished or substantially altered without approval from a heritage committee that no longer existed, making demolition legally impossible. A ledger documenting 60 years of bribes paid to city officials with dates, amounts, and names that would destroy careers and end political dynasties. Photographs of forged documents next to their originals, the proof of fraud laid out with mathematical precision, and a final letter, addressed to whoever finds this, in which Margaret explained everything, how she had discovered Richard's plan, how she had confronted him, how he had responded with threats and finally with action, how she had prepared this room as her last refuge, not realizing he would seal the entrance and leave her to suffocate in the darkness. At the bottom of the letter, in handwriting that grew increasingly shaky as oxygen ran out, Margaret had written, "He thinks he has won, but truth is patient. Truth waits, and someday someone will find this room and finish what I started." They had just finished photographing Margaret's skeletal remains and the damning evidence surrounding her when they heard it. The sound of multiple vehicles pulling into the driveway, doors slamming, and heavy footsteps on the front porch. Sarah and David exchanged a glance of pure terror, both understanding that they had run out of time, that whoever had been monitoring their investigation had decided the moment for subtlety had passed. They climbed the basement stairs and found 3 men standing in the front hallway, having entered through the unlocked door with the confidence of people who considered themselves above such mundane concerns as trespassing. The man in the center was Richard Ashford III, even more imposing in person than in his corporate photographs, dressed in an expensive charcoal suit that probably cost more than Sarah's truck, his silver hair perfectly styled, his face a mask of practiced concern that didn't quite reach his cold, calculating eyes. The 2 men flanking him were introduced as building inspectors, but their ill-fitting county uniforms and the obvious bulges of shoulder holsters beneath their jackets told a different story. These were private security, muscle dressed up as officials, and their hands never strayed far from their weapons. "Miss Bennet, Mr. Morrison," Richard said, his voice smooth and cultured, the voice of a man accustomed to boardrooms and country clubs. "I apologize for the intrusion, but given the serious structural issues with this property and your continued refusal to vacate, I felt it necessary to intervene personally." He gestured around the dusty parlor with evident distaste. "I'm here to make you an offer that I hope will resolve this unfortunate situation to everyone's satisfaction. Ashford Development Corporation is prepared to purchase this property from you for $100,000, cash, with the transaction completed by the end of business today. That's more than 300 times what you paid. A remarkable return on your investment, and all you need to do is sign over the deed and walk away." Sarah, her phone in her pocket still recording everything, her hands shaking but her voice steady, met his eyes directly. "I'm not selling, Mr. Ashford. Not for 100,000. Not for $1 million. This house isn't for sale, especially not to the family that murdered Margaret Ashford and sealed her body in a hidden room to rot." The effect of her words was instantaneous and dramatic. Richard's carefully constructed mask of civility shattered like glass, his face contorting with rage and something that might have been fear, his smooth corporate demeanor replaced by the naked aggression of a predator whose prey had dared to fight back. "You stupid, stupid girl," he hissed, his voice low and venomous. "You have no idea what you're playing with, no idea of the power and resources at my disposal." Margaret was a senile old woman who couldn't understand progress, couldn't see that history is just dead weight holding back the future, and she paid the price for her stubbornness. He stepped closer, and the 2 security men moved with him, creating a wall of intimidation. "You have 12 hours to sign over this property and disappear. If you refuse, If you try to take any of this to the authorities, you will discover that I own this city from the mayor's office down to the clerk who files building permits, and you will suffer an unfortunate accident, a structural collapse perhaps, or a gas leak, the kind of tragedy that happens when people ignore evacuation orders and stay in condemned buildings. His smile was a predator's expression, all teeth and no warmth. 5 families before you made the smart choice and ran. You can be the 6th and live, or you can be like Margaret and become just another mystery that no one bothers to solve. Richard Ashford left with his security men, and the silence that followed his departure was more terrifying than any manufactured haunting could ever be. Because Sarah and David both knew that the 12-hour ultimatum was a lie, that someone accustomed to wielding power with impunity would not wait patiently while his victims potentially escaped or called for help. They spent the afternoon preparing for a siege, moving food and water down to the hidden room, charging their phones, and most importantly, uploading every photograph they had taken to a secure cloud storage account that David's tech-savvy sister managed, ensuring that even if something happened to them, the evidence would survive. As darkness fell, they kept watch from the upstairs windows, taking turns sleeping and standing guard, and it was just after 2 in the morning when the assault began in earnest. The first window exploded inward with a crash that sent glass spraying across the bedroom floor, not from a thrown rock but from a deliberate blow with a crowbar, and before they could react, 2 more windows shattered in quick succession, the sound of breaking glass mixing with the wail of the wind that poured through the openings. The technological hauntings had been replaced by something far more visceral and terrifying, actual human violence. Sarah grabbed her phone and dialed 911, her fingers shaking as she tried to explain their situation to the dispatcher, but the woman's responses were maddeningly slow, asking for addresses and descriptions and details while masked figures were climbing through the shattered windows, their silhouettes dark against the ambient light from the street. "Officers are on their way," the dispatcher said with bureaucratic calm. "Please stay on the line and remain in a safe location until they arrive." But Sarah could hear the subtext, the lack of urgency, the tone of someone following a script rather than responding to a genuine emergency, and she understood that Richard's boast about owning the city from top to bottom had not been an exaggeration. David, who had been watching from the hallway, saw the first intruder's boot come through the window and reacted with a violence that surprised them both, grabbing the fire poker from beside the cold fireplace and swinging it in a wide arc that connected with the intruder's knee, producing a howl of pain and sending the man tumbling backward out the window. But there were more coming, at least 4 or 5 of them, moving with coordinated precision through multiple entry points, and David's single-handed defense could not hold them all back. "The hidden room," Sarah yelled, grabbing the bag they had packed with Margaret's most crucial evidence, the original deed and the ledger of bribes, documents small enough to carry but devastating enough to destroy the Ashford empire. They ran for the library, David backing down the hallway, the fire poker held like a weapon, buying seconds with each swing as the masked intruders pursued them. Sarah reached the bookshelf door and pulled it open, the mechanism responding smoothly to her touch, and she plunged into the darkness of the stone staircase, David right behind her. He reached the landing just as the first intruder entered the library, and with strength born of desperation, David grabbed the heavy bookshelf from the inside and pulled it closed, the hidden door sealing with a solid thunk. They could hear the muffled sounds of the intruders above, searching the library, their footsteps moving back and forth, and then someone found the trigger book and the door began to swing open. David was ready, bracing his back against the stone wall and his feet against the bookshelf, using his body as a human wedge to hold it closed. Above them, the intruders pushed harder, but the angle and David's leverage held, and after several minutes of futile effort, the pressure ceased. They were trapped in the hidden room with Margaret's skeleton and her evidence, while above them, armed men controlled their house, and the corrupt authorities Richard Ashford owned would take their time responding to a call for help that would probably be logged as a false alarm or a domestic disturbance, nothing that required urgency or investigation. They sat in the darkness of the hidden room for what felt like hours but was probably only 40 minutes, listening to the sounds of systematic destruction above them as the intruders tore through the house, searching for the evidence they knew Sarah and David must have found. And Sarah had just begun to accept that they might die down here, sealed in this stone tomb with Margaret's bones, when a new sound filtered down from above, sirens, multiple vehicles, and then a voice amplified by a bullhorn that cut through the chaos with unmistakable authority. "This is the state police. Everyone in the building exit through the front door with your hands visible. This property is now a crime scene and you are trespassing on state evidence. The sounds of destruction ceased immediately, replaced by frantic footsteps and muffled cursing, and then the blessed sound of car doors slamming and vehicles speeding away into the night. Sarah and David remained frozen, not daring to believe, not trusting that this might actually be rescue rather than another layer of Ashford's elaborate trap, until they heard a voice they recognized calling down the stone staircase. "Sarah, David, it's Eleanor Marks. You can come up now. You're safe. My son is here." They emerged from the hidden room like prisoners released from a dungeon, blinking in the harsh light of police flashlights, and found the library filled with state troopers in full tactical gear, their weapons drawn, their faces grim with professional intensity. Eleanor stood among them looking small and fierce, and beside her was a man in his late 50s wearing a state police detective's badge, his weathered face bearing a striking resemblance to his mother's sharp, intelligent features. "I'm Detective Thomas Marks," he said, extending a hand to Sarah, his grip firm and reassuring. "My mother called me 3 hours ago and told me that 2 young people had bought the Ashford house and were about to be killed for it. I've had a team en route since then. I'm sorry we couldn't get here faster." He looked around at the destruction, the shattered windows, the overturned furniture, his expression hardening. "I've been investigating Ashford Development Corporation for 7 years. Ever since a property developer in the capital committed suicide after losing everything to what we now know was a coordinated campaign of harassment and fraud. We've had complaints from dozens of families, witnesses who described the same pattern of code violations and manufactured problems. But every time we tried to build a case, the evidence would disappear, witnesses would recant. Local officials would stonewall us, and we'd hit a dead end." He looked at Sarah with an intensity that was almost painful. "My mother says you found something that belonged to Margaret Ashford. And if that's true, if you actually have documentation of the company's criminal activities going back to the beginning, then we finally have a chance to break this case wide open." Sarah nodded, pulling out her phone and showing him the photographs of Margaret's body, the original deed, the ledger of bribes. And Thomas's face went through a rapid evolution of emotions. Shock, then grief, then a cold, focused anger. "We need to get this evidence and you to the State Attorney General's office in the capital tonight, right now, before Richard Ashford realizes his cleanup crew failed and tries something more desperate. But I have to warn you, the local police are compromised, probably some of the county officials too, so the drive is going to be dangerous, and you'll both need to be willing to testify to everything you've seen." Detective Marks worked quickly, his years of experience evident in the way he assessed the situation and formulated a plan with military precision. And within 20 minutes, he had coordinated with his team and laid out a strategy that acknowledged the terrible reality they faced. Richard Ashford had eyes everywhere, and any convoy of state police vehicles leaving the property would be tracked, followed, and potentially intercepted by people with resources and connections that made them extremely dangerous. "I've got 4 unmarked vehicles positioned around the neighborhood," Thomas explained, spreading a hand-drawn map across the dusty library table. "But I guarantee you there's at least 2 surveillance teams watching this house right now. Probably that panel van 3 blocks down and a sedan parked near the corner. They'll have night vision, communications equipment, and they'll report the moment we try to leave with you." He looked at Sarah and David, his expression grim. "We need a diversion. Something that draws their attention while we get you and the evidence out through a route they're not watching." It was David who volunteered for the dangerous part, his jaw set with determination despite the fear in his eyes. "I'll leave through the front door, make it obvious, carry a briefcase or a bag that looks like it could hold documents, and get into one of your marked vehicles. I'll lead them on a chase while Sarah gets out the back." Sarah started to protest, but David gripped her hand, his voice firm. "You're the one who found Margaret. You're the one who understands all the evidence. You need to be the one who survives to testify. I'll be fine. I'll have state police protection the whole time." Thomas nodded slowly, then turned to Sarah. "My mother mentioned that when she was a girl, Margaret Ashford showed her a secret passage that connected the basement of this house to the basement of the property next door. It was built during Prohibition as an escape route, and if it still exists, if we can get you through it, you can emerge at Eleanor's house while Ashford's people are following David in the opposite direction." They descended to the main basement, and it took 15 minutes of searching before they found it. a section of the foundation wall that was slightly different in color, newer mortar-holding stones that could be removed, and behind them was indeed a narrow tunnel, barely 4 feet high and lined with crumbling brick, stretching away into darkness. Eleanor, despite her 80-plus years, insisted on being the one to guide Sarah through the passage and then drive her to the Capitol, her fierce determination brooking no argument. I knew Margaret Ashford. I loved that woman like family, and I'll be damned if I let her murderers win after all these years. Besides, who's going to stop an old lady in a sensible sedan? The plan went into motion at dawn, time to catch the surveillance teams in that vulnerable moment when night vision becomes useless but full daylight has not yet arrived. David walked out the front door carrying a briefcase filled with old newspapers, climbed into a marked state police vehicle with great ceremony, and roared off toward the highway with 2 additional police cars as escort. And as predicted, both surveillance vehicles immediately pulled out to follow, their operators reporting in to whatever command structure Richard Ashford had established. While this drama unfolded at the front of the property, Sarah crawled through that narrow, claustrophobic tunnel with the real evidence secured in a waterproof bag strapped to her back. Eleanor's voice, calling encouragement from ahead, and emerged 30 minutes later in the dusty basement of Eleanor's perfectly maintained home, her clothes filthy and her hands scraped but her cargo intact. They climbed into Eleanor's ancient but immaculately maintained sedan, and as the sun rose over Ashford Street, they drove sedately toward the state capitol. 2 women, separated by 50 years in age but united by a commitment to justice, carrying evidence that would finally give Margaret Ashford the vindication she had died seeking. The drive to the state capitol took 3 hours, Eleanor maintaining a steady, unremarkable speed, while Sarah sat in the passenger seat clutching the waterproof bag and checking her phone obsessively for updates from David, who texted that he was safe, that the decoy convoy had led Ashford's surveillance teams on a wild chase halfway across the county before losing them near the state border. They arrived at the Attorney General's office just after 9 in the morning, and Eleanor, who apparently had connections Sarah was only beginning to appreciate, walked them past security and directly into the office of Attorney General Patricia Hollis, a woman in her 60s with steel-gray hair and eyes that had seen every form of corruption humanity could devise. Sarah laid out the evidence on the conference table with shaking hands, the photographs of Margaret's skeletal remains seated at her desk, the pen still in her hand after 64 years. The original 1892 deed with its ironclad preservation clauses that made demolition legally impossible. The ledger documenting decades of bribes with dates, amounts, and names written in Margaret's meticulous script, and the photographs of forged property transfers next to copies of the originals, showing how Richard Ashford had systematically stolen properties throughout the historic district. Attorney General Hollis examined each piece of evidence with the careful attention of a surgeon, her expression growing progressively darker, and then she opened the ledger and began reading the names aloud, her voice thick with barely controlled fury. Judge Marcus Vance, $50,000, March 1958. Notation. Ruled in favor of expedited demolition. City Councilman Robert Chen, $20,000 annually from 1,965 to 1,992. Notation. Blocked all historic preservation ordinances. Bank President Thomas Morrison, $15,000 per property. Notation. Denied loans to families fighting acquisition. Approved fraudulent appraisals. The list went on and on, a comprehensive documentation of systematic corruption that had infected every level of local government and business, a web of complicity that had allowed the Ashford family to operate with impunity for more than half a century. Hollis called in her senior investigators, and for the next 4 hours, Sarah walked them through everything she and David had discovered. From the manufactured hauntings using hidden speakers and motion sensors to the pattern of code violations that had driven 5 families from the property, from Eleanor's testimony about Margaret's disappearance to the fresh boot prints in the hidden room that proved someone had been monitoring their investigation. The investigators cross-referenced Margaret's ledger with property records, and what emerged was a picture of devastation that went far beyond Sarah's single house. 37 historic Victorian and colonial homes, demolished between 1955 and 2010, each one irreplaceable. Each one a piece of architectural history erased and replaced with strip malls and parking lots. 143 families systematically defrauded through a combination of legal manipulation and psychological warfare. losing their homes and life savings to a corporation that treated human suffering as acceptable collateral damage in pursuit of profit, and perhaps most damning, evidence that 3 property owners who had threatened to go public with their complaints had died in what were ruled accidents: a gas explosion, a suspicious car crash, and a fall down basement stairs, all occurring within weeks of their threatened exposures. By mid-afternoon, Attorney General Hollis had assembled a task force of 20 investigators and secured emergency warrants from a state judge. And she looked at Sarah with an expression that mixed admiration with deep concern. "What you've done is extraordinarily brave and extraordinarily dangerous. Richard Ashford is going to realize very soon that his cleanup operation failed, and desperate men with unlimited resources are capable of anything. I'm placing you and David in protective custody until we can execute these warrants and secure the crime scene at your property." While Sarah was safely ensconced in a secure conference room at the Attorney General's office, David had returned to 47 Ashford Street under state police protection, his role in the decoy operation complete. His job now to secure the property and wait for the forensic teams who would document the crime scene where Margaret Ashford had been murdered and sealed in her tomb. The 2 state troopers assigned to guard him were professional and alert, positioned at the front and back doors, but none of them expected Richard Ashford to be reckless enough to make another move while law enforcement was actively involved, which was exactly the miscalculation that nearly cost David his life. It was just after 2 in the afternoon when the convoy arrived. 3 large trucks, a county vehicle, and a crew of 8 men wearing hard hats and safety vests, all bearing the logos of a legitimate demolition company. The man in charge, a supervisor with a clipboard and an official-looking badge, approached the front door with a document that he claimed was an emergency condemnation and demolition order signed by a county judge, citing imminent structural collapse and danger to neighboring properties, and he informed the state troopers with bureaucratic authority that they had 30 minutes to evacuate before the controlled demolition would commence. The troopers, uncertain of their jurisdiction in what appeared to be a legitimate county operation, called it in to their supervisor, and in the confusion and chaos of multiple agencies trying to sort out authority and paperwork, the demolition crew began their work, moving into the house with practiced efficiency. David, watching from the upstairs window as the crew unloaded equipment, felt a sick certainty that this was not a legitimate operation but Ashford's final, desperate attempt to destroy the evidence. And when he saw 2 men carrying what looked like heavy canvas bags toward the basement stairs, he understood with terrible clarity what they were planning. They were going to bring the house down with explosives, and they were going to do it whether anyone was inside or not. He tried to leave through the front door, but the supervisor blocked his way, his friendly facade dropping to reveal cold calculation beneath. "I'm sorry, sir, but for safety reasons, no one can exit during the setup phase. Demolition protocols, you understand. Just stay calm, and we'll have you out in a few minutes." The man's hand rested meaningfully on David's chest, and David saw the bulge of a weapon under his safety vest, understanding that these were not demolition workers but Ashford's security team dressed in convincing costumes. He backed away slowly, his mind racing through options, and when the supervisor turned to consult with his crew, David ran for the basement stairs, taking them 2 at a time, his only thought to somehow stop or delay whatever they were setting up below. The basement was a maze of shadows and old furniture, and in the far corner, near the false wall that concealed Margaret's tomb, 2 men were indeed setting charges. Military-grade explosives wired to a digital timer, their experienced hands working with the efficiency of professionals who had done this before. They saw David at the same moment he saw them, and one reached for his radio while the other pulled a weapon. And David realized with the sick certainty of a man staring at his own death that he had perhaps 3 minutes before they activated those charges, and there was no way out. The stairs were blocked, the basement windows too small to crawl through, and he was trapped in a house that was about to become his grave. Sarah was reviewing additional documents with Attorney General Hollis when her phone rang, and Detective Marks's voice on the other end was tight with barely controlled panic as he explained that a demolition crew had arrived at the property with what appeared to be legitimate county paperwork, that his troopers had been unable to stop them due to jurisdictional confusion, and that David was still inside the house, while the crew was now evacuating in a suspicious hurry. Sarah felt her blood turn to ice as the implications crashed over her, understanding instantly that this was Richard Ashford's final move, that if he could not acquire the property legally and could not silence the witnesses quietly, he would simply destroy everything. the house and everyone in it, and claim it was a tragic accident during a legitimate emergency demolition. She was running for the parking garage before Marks finished speaking. Attorney General Hollis right behind her, barking orders into her own phone for every available state police unit to converge on 47 Ashford Street with lights and sirens. Jurisdiction be damned. They made the 3-hour drive in 90 minutes. Sarah white-knuckled in the passenger seat of Hollis's official vehicle while a convoy of state police cars screamed down the highway behind them, lights flashing, sirens wailing, traffic parting before them like a biblical sea. Sarah's phone kept buzzing with updates from Marks. The demolition crew had finished their work and was pulling out. David was not responding to calls. The house was now empty except for him. And most terrifyingly, one of the state troopers had spotted wiring and heard the distinctive beeping of a digital timer. They arrived at Ashford Street to find chaos. The demolition trucks speeding away, state troopers trying to establish a perimeter, neighbors being evacuated, and the Victorian house standing in the late afternoon sun looking deceptively peaceful, its broken windows and damaged facade giving no indication of the explosive charges hidden in its basement. Counting down to detonation, Detective Marks grabbed Sarah's arm as she leaped from the vehicle, his face desperate. "We've got a bomb squad en route, but they're 20 minutes out. We've tried calling into the house, but David's not answering. Sarah, you cannot go in there if those charges blow." But Sarah was already pulling free, her mind clear and focused, because she knew something the bomb squad did not, something even David in his panic might have forgotten. The house had multiple hidden passages, routes that Margaret Ashford had built into her fortress of a home. And one of them connected the main basement to the hidden room, a small crawl space that Richard's hired demolition team would never have known to look for, would never have thought to wire with explosives. She ran toward the house, ignoring the shouts behind her, ignoring Hollis's command to stop, ignoring everything except the knowledge that David was somewhere inside, probably trying to disarm charges he had no training to handle, and she was the only person alive who knew every secret the house held. She crashed through the front door and immediately heard it, the steady electronic beeping from below, faster now, more urgent, and she realized they had perhaps 2 minutes, maybe less, before the house came down around them. "David," she screamed, her voice echoing through the damaged rooms. "David, where are you?" A faint response came from the basement, and Sarah plunged down the stairs into the dim space below, her eyes adjusting to find David frantically working at a tangle of wires near the false wall, his hands shaking, his face slick with sweat. "I can't stop it," he gasped. "I've tried everything, it's going to blow." Sarah grabbed his hand and pulled him toward the hidden room entrance, toward the secret passage she had used just hours before, toward the one route out that the demolition team had never known existed. Sarah yanked David away from the useless tangle of wires, the beeping, now a frantic staccato that filled the basement with the sound of approaching death, and she pulled him toward what looked like a solid section of stone wall beside the hidden room entrance, a wall that she had noticed during their hours exploring the secret chamber, but had dismissed as unimportant until this moment, when it became their only hope for survival. Her fingers found the seam, barely visible in the dim light, and she pressed hard on a protruding stone that gave way with a grinding sound, revealing a narrow passage no wider than her shoulders. A servants' corridor built in the 1890 seconds, when domestic staff needed to move through the house unseen by the owners and guests. "Go, go now," she screamed at David, shoving him into the darkness, and they crawled on hands and knees through a tunnel lined with ancient brick, the passage so tight that David's shoulders scraped the walls, the air thick with dust and the smell of a century of disuse. Behind them, the beeping reached its crescendo and then stopped, and in that moment of terrible silence, the world exploded into sound and fury as the first charges detonated in the basement, the shock wave traveling through the foundation like an earthquake, sending chunks of stone and mortar raining down around them. The passage began to collapse, sections of the brick ceiling falling behind them in cascading avalanches, and Sarah could feel the entire structure of the house above them starting to shift and fail. 130 years of architecture surrendering to gravity and explosives. David's hand found hers in the darkness, their fingers locking together, and they crawled faster, racing the collapse, their knees bloody and their lungs burning with dust and terror, following the passage as it angled upward toward what Sarah prayed was still an exit. The tunnel terminated in a vertical shaft, perhaps 8 feet tall, with rusty metal rungs embedded in the brick, and above them was a heavy metal hatch, a coal chute that had once allowed deliveries to be made directly into the basement, but had been sealed for decades. David went first, climbing the rungs with desperate speed, and when he reached the hatch, he braced his back against the brick wall and kicked upward with both feet, once, twice, 3 times, until the corroded hinges finally gave way and the metal panel flew open, revealing a square of blessed daylight. He pulled himself through and then reached back for Sarah, grabbing her arms and hauling her up and out just as the main support beam in the basement gave way with a sound like 1,000 trees falling at once. They emerged onto the side lawn, rolling away from the house, and from their position on the ground they watched the Victorian mansion at 47 Ashford Street die its final death. The center of the structure collapsed first, the roof falling into the upper floors. Then the walls began to buckle and fall outward in clouds of dust and smoke. The ornate facade that had stood for more than a century crumbling like a sandcastle before a wave, and within 30 seconds, nothing remained but a pile of rubble and a massive cloud of dust that rose into the evening sky like a funeral shroud. Sarah and David lay in the grass, coughing and bleeding and alive, and through the ringing in their ears they heard shouting, footsteps, and then Detective Marks was there, pulling them further from the wreckage, checking them for injuries, his face a mixture of relief and rage. Beyond him, Sarah saw a scene that made the pain and terror worth it. Richard Ashford III being pulled from his expensive car by state troopers, his hands being forced behind his back and secured with handcuffs, his perfect silver hair disheveled and his face contorted with fury and disbelief as Attorney General Hollis herself read him his rights. And standing behind him were 3 members of his demolition crew, also in custody, their fake safety vests and hard hats now evidence of conspiracy to commit murder. The story broke like a thunderclap across the national news cycle within hours of Richard Ashford III's arrest, and by the next morning, 47 Ashford Street, or rather the smoking ruins of what had been 47 Ashford Street, was surrounded by satellite trucks and journalists from every major network, all desperate to cover what was being called the largest case of organized corruption and property fraud in state history. Sarah and David, bruised and bandaged and still coughing up dust from the collapse, found themselves at the center of a media storm that transformed them from anonymous young people into heroes, though Sarah insisted in every interview that the real hero was Margaret Ashford, a woman who had died alone in the darkness 64 years ago but whose meticulous documentation of evil had finally found its purpose. The photographs of Margaret's skeletal remains, seated at her desk with pen in hand, became an iconic image that ran on front pages across the country, a haunting testament to courage and the price of standing against corruption, and within days, historians and preservationists were calling for her to be posthumously honored with every civic award the state could bestow. The initial charges against Richard Ashford III were attempted murder, conspiracy, illegal demolition, and obstruction of justice. But as Attorney General Hollis's investigators dug deeper into Margaret's evidence and cross-referenced it with modern records, the case metastasized into something far larger and more complex. The ledger of bribes that Margaret had documented in the 1,950 seconds provided a roadmap for investigators to follow forward in time, and they discovered that the corruption had not ended with Richard Sr.'s death, but had been carefully cultivated and expanded by his son and grandson, a family business of fraud that spanned 3 generations. By the end of the first week, 47 arrest warrants had been issued, including 3 sitting city councilmen, 2 judges, the county building inspector Gerald Pritchard, and a dozen business associates who had facilitated the schemes. The FBI became involved when investigators discovered that Ashford Development's operations extended across state lines, with similar patterns of harassment and manufactured hauntings used to drive property owners from their homes in Pennsylvania, Ohio, and West Virginia. A multi-state conspiracy that had defrauded hundreds of families and destroyed countless pieces of irreplaceable architectural history. Sarah and David spent 3 days testifying before a grand jury, walking the prosecutors and jurors through every detail of their discovery, from the moment Sarah raised her hand at the county auction to the moment they crawled through the collapsing tunnel as explosives destroyed the evidence of Margaret's murder. David described the hidden speakers and motion sensors, the sophisticated system designed to simulate paranormal activity, while Sarah presented the photographs and documents that proved a pattern of systematic intimidation going back decades. The families who had fled 47 Ashford Street before them, 5 separate households who had thought themselves weak or crazy for running from a haunted house, came forward one by one, their testimonies painting a picture of calculated psychological warfare that had destroyed lives and marriages, cost people their savings and their sanity, all in service of a corporation's bottomless greed. Eleanor Marks, her testimony delivered with the fierce clarity of a woman who had waited 60 years to see justice done, described watching her grandmother's best friend disappear and knowing in her heart that Margaret Ashford had been murdered, but being powerless to prove it until two stubborn young people had refused to run when running was the smart, safe thing to do. The trial of Richard Ashford III lasted 8 weeks, every day of it covered by national media, and the courtroom was packed with survivors of his family's decades-long campaign of terror. Families who had lost everything to manufactured fears and systematic fraud, their presence a silent testament to the human cost of unchecked corporate power. The prosecution, led by Attorney General Hollis herself, methodically presented Margaret Ashford's evidence alongside testimony from dozens of witnesses, building a case so comprehensive and damning that Richard's expensive team of defense attorneys could do nothing but watch their client's empire crumble under the weight of truth. The photographs of Margaret's skeleton, the ledgers documenting 60 years of bribes, the recordings of Richard threatening Sarah and David, the testimony of the demolition crew members who had agreed to cooperate in exchange for reduced sentences, all of it combined to paint a picture of a man who had inherited not just wealth, but a legacy of evil, and had embraced it with enthusiasm. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning with guilty verdicts on all 43 counts: conspiracy to commit murder, attempted murder, fraud, racketeering, bribery, obstruction of justice, illegal demolition, and a litany of other charges that would ensure Richard Ashford III would spend the rest of his life in prison without possibility of parole. When the verdict was read, Sarah watched Richard's face transform from arrogant confidence to hollow disbelief, and she felt not triumph, but a profound sadness that so much suffering had been caused by one family's inability to see human beings as anything more than obstacles to profit. The convictions rippled outward, taking down the web of corruption that had protected the Ashford empire for generations. Judge Marcus Vance, who had expedited demolition permits for bribes, received 15 years. Gerald Pritchard, the building inspector who had terrorized 5 families with manufactured violations, received 10 years and the permanent loss of his professional license. 3 city councilmen who had blocked historic preservation ordinances in exchange for campaign contributions resigned in disgrace and faced their own criminal trials. The FBI's investigation, now expanded to cover 4 states, had identified 173 properties that had been illegally acquired through Ashford development schemes, and Attorney General Hollis announced the creation of a victim compensation fund, seeded with the liquidated assets of the Ashford Corporation, that would provide restitution to every family who had lost their homes, their savings, or their peace of mind to the company's systematic fraud. The families who had fled 47 Ashford Street received priority consideration, their terror and loss finally acknowledged and at least partially repaired through financial compensation that could never truly make them whole, but offered a measure of justice. But perhaps the most moving moment in the aftermath came on a cold November morning, when Margaret Ashford was finally laid to rest in the city's historic cemetery, her remains transferred from the medical examiner's office to a grave site beside her son Thomas, the war hero she had never stopped mourning. The funeral was attended by hundreds, city officials, historians, preservation advocates, and ordinary citizens who had followed the story and been moved by this woman's courage, and the mayor, speaking at the graveside, announced that a new historic preservation ordinance, the strongest in the state, would be named in Margaret's honor, ensuring that her life's work protecting the city's architectural heritage would continue long after her death. Sarah and David stood at the back of the crowd, watching as Margaret Ashford was finally given the recognition and honor she had been denied in life, and Sarah placed a single white rose on the coffin, whispering a promise that Margaret's sacrifice would never be forgotten. The settlement from the lawsuit against Ashford Development Corporation was substantial, nearly $2 million that represented decades of stolen value and destroyed lives. And when combined with emergency historic preservation grants from both the state and federal governments, Sarah found herself with the resources to do something she had dreamed about since the moment the Victorian mansion collapsed into rubble: rebuild it exactly as Margaret Ashford had originally designed it, stone by stone, beam by beam, a resurrection of history and a monument to truth. She hired architects who specialized in historic restoration, and together they pored over the original 1,892 blueprints that had been preserved in the county archives, supplementing them with photographs from historical societies and detailed descriptions from Eleanor, whose childhood memories of visiting Margaret included vivid recollections of the house's layout, its ornate woodwork, its soaring ceilings, and its hidden passages. The reconstruction took 18 months, and Sarah was on site nearly every day, watching as skilled craftsmen rebuilt the foundation on the exact footprint of the original, using stone quarried from the same geological formations that had supplied the 1,892 construction, ensuring that even the material composition would honor Margaret's vision. The framework rose slowly, massive timber beams cut and joined using traditional techniques rather than modern shortcuts. And as the structure took shape, Sarah could feel the house coming back to life, not as a reproduction, but as a true restoration, a phoenix rising from the ashes of Richard Ashford's final act of destruction. The exterior was painstakingly recreated, the wraparound porch with its ornate spindles carved by hand to match the few fragments that had survived the collapse. The tall, narrow windows with their original wavy glass salvaged from architectural salvage yards, the steep roof with its complex angles and the stone chimney that rose 3 stories into the sky, and finally the paint. Multiple layers applied in the exact colors that historical analysis had revealed Margaret had chosen, deep forest green with cream trim and burgundy accents. But it was the interior where Sarah made her most important decision, one that transformed the house from a private residence into something far more significant. She preserved the hidden rooms exactly as they had been, not as secret chambers, but as the heart of a living museum dedicated to Margaret Ashford's courage and to the victims of corporate corruption. The basement room where Margaret's body had been found was reconstructed with archaeological precision, the stone walls rebuilt, the wooden desk restored and placed in the exact position where Margaret had sat, writing her final accusations against her murderous grandson, and behind protective glass, visitors could see reproductions of the evidence that had brought down an empire. The ledgers, the forged documents, the map of targeted properties, and photographs of Margaret herself, young and vital and fierce, a reminder that the skeleton in the hidden room had once been a living, breathing woman who had chosen truth over family, justice over comfort, and had paid the ultimate price for that choice. The first hidden room, accessed through the bookshelf door that still swung open with a touch of the Poe volume, became an exhibition space documenting the 5 families who had been terrorized by manufactured hauntings, their stories told through their own words in diary entries and letters, accompanied by the actual hidden speakers and motion sensors that had been used to drive them from their homes. Technology that looked crude and almost silly when displayed in the light, but had been devastatingly effective in the darkness and isolation of psychological warfare. Eleanor Marks, at 84 years old, accepted the position of curator with a fierce joy that took decades off her weathered face, and she took to the role with the passion of someone who had waited a lifetime to tell a story that needed telling. She conducted tours herself, her voice strong and clear as she guided visitors through the house, sharing not just the facts of the conspiracy but the human stories behind them. Her personal memories of Margaret Ashford giving weight and warmth to what might otherwise have been just another tale of historic corruption, and she made sure every visitor understood that the house was not just a museum of the past, but a warning for the present, a reminder that corruption thrives in silence, and that ordinary people have the power to resist extraordinary evil if they choose courage over comfort. The house opened to the public on the anniversary of Margaret's death, September 20th, and the line of visitors stretched around the block, hundreds of people coming to pay their respects to a woman who had become a symbol of resistance and integrity. And Sarah stood on the rebuilt porch, watching families enter the front door, and she felt Margaret's presence not as a ghost but as a legacy, a whisper of encouragement that said some houses are worth fighting for, some truths are worth dying for, and some stories, no matter how long they are buried, will always find their way back to the light. Sarah and David stood on the freshly painted porch of 47 Ashford Street on a brilliant spring morning, 2 years and 3 months after the day Sarah had raised her hand at a county auction and bought a house that everyone said was cursed. And they looked at the gleaming brass plaque that had been installed beside the front door just yesterday, its words etched in permanent metal. Margaret Ashford House, National Register of Historic Places. Restored 2026. In memory of Margaret Elizabeth Ashford, 1875 to 1960. Who chose truth over silence? The house that had been a place of fear and tragedy had been transformed into something else entirely. A destination for school groups learning about civic courage, for architecture students studying Victorian design, for families who had lost their own homes to corporate greed and needed to see that justice, though delayed, could still prevail. The transformation extended beyond the physical structure to the very meaning of the address itself. 47 Ashford Street was no longer whispered as a cautionary tale, but spoken with reverence. And the property value of the entire historic district had soared, as people recognized that preserving the past was not an obstacle to progress, but the very foundation of a meaningful future. Sarah had moved into the restored house permanently, occupying the upper floor as her private residence while the ground floor and basement served as the museum. And David, who had proposed to her in the rubble-strewn lot during the early days of reconstruction, had insisted that when they married, it should be here, in the house that had brought them together and nearly killed them, in the room where their greatest discovery had begun. The wedding took place on a Saturday afternoon in October. The library transformed with white flowers and candles, the bookshelf door standing open as a reminder rather than a secret, and 50 guests crowded into the space where Sarah had once pulled a volume of Poe and watched a hidden passage reveal itself. Eleanor served as the matron of honor, her eyes bright with tears of joy as she watched two young people make vows of commitment in a house that had finally become what Margaret Ashford had always intended it to be, a place of truth, permanence, and love that could withstand any assault. Detective Thomas Marks walked Sarah down the aisle, his presence a symbol of the justice that had finally been served, and Attorney General Hollis attended as an honored guest, her successful prosecution of the Ashford conspiracy having propelled her to national prominence and a widely anticipated run for governor. The ceremony was simple and heartfelt, the judge who officiated speaking of how rare it was to see two people whose love had been forged not in comfort but in shared danger, whose partnership had been tested by forces that would have broken lesser bonds. And as Sarah and David exchanged rings, the afternoon sun streamed through the tall Victorian windows, illuminating the room in golden light that seemed almost supernatural in its perfection. After the ceremony, as guests mingled and celebrated, Sarah found herself standing alone for a moment in the entrance hall, looking up at the portrait that had been commissioned by the Historical Society and now hung in the place of honor. Margaret Ashford at age 40, painted from a photograph, her intelligent eyes gazing out with determination and a hint of sadness, as if she had known even then what her principles would cost her. Sarah had stood before this portrait countless times since its installation, but today, in her wedding dress, with David's ring on her finger and the sounds of celebration echoing through rooms that had once known only fear and silence, she felt a connection to Margaret that transcended time and circumstance, a recognition that spanned a century between two women who had refused to be intimidated by power, who had chosen truth over safety, who had understood that some things, some principles, some legacies, were worth any sacrifice. She thought about the young woman she had been at that county auction, wearing a bright yellow shirt and raising her hand despite every warning, despite the whispers and the fear, driven by something she could not have articulated then but understood clearly now, the need to prove that ordinary people could stand against extraordinary corruption, that houses were more than just structures but repositories of memory and meaning, that the past was not dead but alive in every choice the present made. The curse that had driven 5 families into the night was revealed as nothing more than technology and cruelty, but the blessing that had emerged from Margaret's hidden room, the legacy of courage that had toppled an empire of fraud, that was real and permanent and growing stronger with each visitor who walked through the restored doors and learned that truth, though it might be buried for decades, could never truly be destroyed. David came to stand beside her, his hand finding hers, and together they looked up at Margaret Ashford's portrait, and Sarah whispered a promise that she had made before and would make again every day for the rest of her life. "We'll keep your story alive. We'll make sure they never forget. We'll make sure your house stands forever." The house that no one had wanted, that had been fought over and died for, that had collapsed into rubble and risen again, was finally, truly, home.